energy democracy, the two major programmatic themes in this argument are the democratized market economy leading to a knowledge economy for the many, and a high energy democracy replacing the flawed, weak democracies of today. But I would rather postpone the discussion, if I could, of democracy and have a discussion about philosophical themes and assumptions in our argument. And let me begin with the following. I think that one of the most penetrating remarks that was ever made about Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal is that most of Roosevelt's programs failed, but the New Deal as a whole was a success. Could someone elucidate this comment? Could someone tell me what it means? Most of Roosevelt's programs failed, but the New Deal as a whole was a success. What can that mean? Yes. Is your speaker on?
That the ideology of the New Deal still continued afterward?
You mean the ideas left an afterglow of some kind? Other
Exactly.
people? What can it mean? Yes?
Is this on? Oh, okay, sure. Maybe an idea, like even though the New Deal was successful and like economic relief, maybe it wasn't the most like in terms of free market and change. Urgency.
Wasn't what?
It wasn't effective beyond just like recovery during a war effort, but maybe wasn't the most and like transformative in terms of like political ideology, perhaps?
Well, what was the transformative part?
I'm saying that maybe there was none. Like I thought like what you were saying with class is that like the only good thing with the New Deal is that it like helped us recover through the Great Depression, but maybe like the actual ideology wasn't actually good if like progressives.
But why did the person who made this remark claim that Roosevelt appeared to have failed, but in fact succeeded? What did he have in mind?
I guess like the way Roosevelt is remembered, the way the New Deal is romanticized, perhaps?
Well, he succeeded in getting it to be romanticized? What's the meaning? What's the claim?
I think it was that he succeeded in getting the economic problems, but it wasn't actually like the most in terms like actually.
So there were a series of programs like the National Recovery Act of 1933, the signature programs, and the author of the comment seems to be claiming that most of those signature programs failed. They didn't work. They were declared unconstitutional, or they were abandoned by the Roosevelt administration itself. Nevertheless, somehow, the New Deal as a whole, he claims, succeeded. In what way could it have succeeded if its practical expressions were repudiated or failed? They didn't work. They were rejected. Many of them rejected by Roosevelt himself. So what can it mean? Anyone else? So the claim seems to be that the meaning of Roosevelt's transformation cannot be reduced to those signature programs, that there was something else, some overflow, some transcendence of those narrow technical, practical expressions. So it's as if someone were to say to Roosevelt, give me examples of your program so I understand your intention. And the person then gives examples, say 5 examples of programs, and they were all flops. But Roosevelt continues to insist, nevertheless, I succeeded. What does it mean? This, by the way, is not just an oddity. This is something that happens all the time in politics, in the life of nations. You have no idea of this, of what it means. So you think the remark is absurd or contradicts itself? So one way to interpret this remark is to say it's a denunciation of a technocratic idea of politics. So many people, many academics interested in politics write books about gimmicks, like having a special day to think about institutions, or a trust fund settled on all babies, this or that, as if a political transformation in the life of a country could be reduced to these gimmicks. So what's the issue there? What's the conception of a transformation that does not allow itself to be reduced to this technocratic pattern? So the least you could say, or one beginning for an explanation of this remark, is that a political project is not a series of these gimmicks. It's not a series of silver bullets of discrete programmatic initiatives. It's a waterfall. It's a current. And what's characteristic of a transformation is that it generates a huge number of proposals and attempts. Roosevelt himself said, I'm a radical experimentalist. I'll try out everything. And he did try out almost everything he could think of. He spoke with everyone. And in a real transformation, hundreds of proposals are generated and tried out. Many of them fail. They succeed one another as rough functional equivalents. And the fact that most of them fail seems not to matter, astonishingly. The only thing that matters is the fecundity and the persistence of the current moving in a particular direction. And the direction and force of the current is not, in fact, reducible to the fate of a handful of initiatives. Is that surprising? Does that seem contradictory? Now, the political technocrats continue to think that everything turns on the success or failure of these particular initiatives. But apparently it doesn't. Apparently what matters is that when one fails, another is tried out, and it continues under another form. with the attributes of life itself. And what are the attributes of life? Spontaneity, fecundity, surprise. Generating new things when old things fail, so that there isn't even time for the failure to set in before a new thing is tried out. That seems to be what the author of the remark is trying to evoke. So Roosevelt tossed off failures, even when he couldn't discern the reason for the failure, and he just kept trying in another form, by another set of methods. Does that seem to you perverse? That's what happens in real life. Now, I want to take as the theme here those transformations among the many kinds of transformations that we have been discussing that are particularly useful to the perpetual creation of the new. That's the underlying theme. The underlying theme is not one particular subset of novelties, the virtues of which we're discussing. The underlying theme is the formation of a culture and a society that has the attribute of being able to create more novelty. And of course you could say, which novelties? The novelties could be bad, they could be perverse. But it seems that in political life, the ability to keep generating novelties has a meaning which transcends the question of whether the particular novelties are good or not. Life itself, a form of social life that acquires the attributes of vitality. Now let's go on with that discussion, with that idea. So one thing that clearly happens in a process of transformation is that a project finds its constituency. There's a marriage of the constituency with the project, an emerging constituency. And the project helps to create its own constituency over time. At first, the constituency merely flirts with the project, then later on, it marries the project. And that in turn seems to be related to the characteristic nature of political agency and its relation to classes and groups. I argued before, there's always more than one way to define and defend a group interest or a class interest. There's always a duality of ways. One way is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive, and another family of ways is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic or inclusive. So take what used to be, up into the middle of the 20th century, the core constituency of the left-leaning parties in the West. The core constituency was organized labor headquartered in conventional industry, in the capital-intensive parts of the economy. And now there's deindustrialization. The old vanguard begins to fall apart and is replaced by a new productive vanguard, which we call the knowledge economy, in an insular form, from which the vast majority of the population and of the firms are excluded. And now, what is the interest of that core constituency? Is the interest to defend at all costs their productive base in the so-called Rust Belt industries, as they're described in the United States, the old mass production industries. A student of those industries might say it's useless. They're not coming back. They're gone forever. All you can do is postpone the day of reckoning. All you can do is postpone the day of their bankruptcy by legal restraints on plant closings, by subsidies to those industries, and so forth. And under that view, the negative view, the institutionally conservative view, the socially exclusive view, the enemies of that segment of the labor force are the groups closest in social space. The foreign workers, the temporary workers, the small business class, and so forth. So its institutionally conservative character goes together with its socially exclusive character. And then you come to the leaders of labor and you tell them, this won't work. All you'll do is buy a few more years for your industry, but it's not coming back. You can simply obfuscate its decline by a series of negative restraints on the enemies and by subsidies to the present firms. But you're not going to reverse the productive decline. That's what a critic would say. Now the question then is there an alternative? And the critic would argue there is an alternative. The alternative is to convert the declining mass production industry into a version of the new vanguard of the knowledge economy. And if you can't convert the industry itself and the corporations that are housing it, you can at least retrain or convert the workers and prepare them to be workers in the new vanguard. Now, what happens characteristically when you take this argument to the leaders of labor? They say, you're asking me to jeopardize my relation to my base before I've created another base for myself. So I'll lose the base I have, and I won't have another base in time. So it's what the economists call a principal agent problem. It doesn't matter to the leaders of labor at the moment that this project has no future. It matters that it will have a future for the next 10 or 20 years, and that's enough for them. But it's not a solution for the class itself. It's not a productivist solution that can have a reliable afterlife. So this duality thesis about agency is, as I observed earlier, the direct opposite of the Marxist view of agency. The Marxist view of agency is that a class, or a segment of the labor force, has an objective interest. And the objective interest becomes manifest and pellucid as class conflict intensifies. So long as class conflict is contained, the class or the segment of the labor force is vulnerable to a misunderstanding of its interests. But class conflict wipes the window clean and makes it transparent. So the more intense the class conflict and the broader its scope, the greater the ability to identify correctly the objective class interest, the objective interest of a segment of the labor force or a class in society. If then labor or its political representatives embrace another view of its interests, they will be making a fatal mistake, and the mistake will be punished by political defeat. That's the Marxist view of class interests. The view that I've just stated in opposition to that view is the direct opposite. It's not just another view, it's actually the inversion of that view, because what it says is that the impression that a class interest has an objective content is an illusion. It's an illusion produced by relative stability or stagnation. As soon as there is a conflict which is productive, if not of an actual alternative, at least of the idea of an alternative, the question, what are my interests as a member of a particular class, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the alternatives? Who would I become under any of these alternatives? And what would then be my interests and indeed my alternatives? David Hume, the philosopher, said, men fight for their interests, but what their interests are is a matter of opinion. And among these opinions, some of the most important are opinions about what's possible. Not what's possible ultimately or theoretically or speculatively, but what's possible practically. What are the adjacent possibilities? What are the possibilities in the realm of the adjacent possible? And what does the play of interests appear to be under those adjacent possibilities? And then, if the leaders of labor at that moment are not receptive to this other view of the possibilities, there has to be a conflict to replace them by other leaders who understand that it's futile to bet on the future of conventional industry. It's necessary to bet on the conversion of the established vanguard into another vanguard with another future under which the interests of those workers will appear to be different. So that's the question. Now, instead of applying this question to the situation of the workers, the skilled and semi-skilled workers in those declining Rust Belt industries, you can apply it to the petty bourgeoisie, or to what I call the subjective petty bourgeoisie, to the small business class, or to the mass of poor workers, much larger than the objective small business class, who have petty bourgeois aspirations. And the question for them is, will they remain fastened to the idea of isolated, relatively unproductive family business as their only option? Or will they develop a version of that idea that presents it as a step in a trajectory leading beyond isolated, archaic family business to some version of the knowledge economy in a particular context, like the context that I described of small-scale agriculture, small-scale entrepreneurial agriculture in the far west of Brazil. So a real dynamic of transformation, to go back to the question that I put to you, cannot be reduced to a set of technocratic gimmicks. It doesn't depend on the canonization of a list of silver bullets. And it points in this direction of the second family of ways of defining and defending a group interest that are structurally transformative and socially solidaristic or inclusive. On that depends the political fate of the progressives or of the leftists. Would someone like to make a comment about this controversy that I've just tried to describe? So in this universe of programmatic suggestions, programmatic proposals that I've been making in the course, what are the ones that are closest, that are most intimate to this ability of a society to be a machine for the perpetual creation of the new, for its fecundity in the creation of novelty? So it seems that the causal primacy goes to the reformation of politics. Politics itself, because politics is not just one more domain of institutional innovation. Politics is the domain that sets the terms on which all the other domains are more or less open to transformation. But there's a problem, because this thesis, which I've just stated, leads often the progressives into a mistake. The mistake is misinterpreting the causal primacy of politics in a literal temporal sense. So then they would say, before we reform anything else, we have to reform politics. And that then is often a mistake. It's a mistake because no country reforms its politics and its state in order only later to decide what to do with the reformed state or the reformed politics. So Roosevelt, for example, wanted to change the economic direction of the country. In the event we've seen, it wasn't in the kind of direction for which I've been arguing. It was in the direction of a corporatist restabilization of the economy. And then later, in the second stage of the New Deal, in the direction of reinforcing antidotes to economic insecurity. And just as he had preferred restabilization to democratization, he preferred in the second stage of the New Deal security for the individual worker and citizen to empowerment for the individual worker and citizen. So the mistake is to interpret the primacy of politics in a literal temporal way. The reform of politics characteristically should not come first and cannot come first. There has to be a struggle over the economic direction or the social direction. And that struggle then dramatizes or demonstrates the need for a state to fulfill the missing condition, to fulfill the missing condition. The instrument has to be recreated for the task to be carried forward. But the struggle over the direction comes first. Now, in the United States, the struggle over the sequel to the Rust Belt industries often takes place at the state level, not at the federal level. Every governor, including all the Republican governors, want to have their own industrial policy. And almost everyone wants to have their own little Silicon Valley. For the most part, it's just a Potemkin village, a facade, without reality. But that suggests that in the United States, the substantive struggle over the creation of the new vanguard would often begin first in the states. And thus there would be a special importance to the recreation of the federal system as the experimentalist laboratory that, according to the Federalist Papers, it was always supposed to be. So then would begin the discussion of a high-energy democracy. Not top-down, not as a theory, but as an imperative of struggle down below at the local level, at the level of the firms and at the level of the states. Now consider another domain for this struggle over interests, identities, and alternatives. The situation of labor and the labor laws, the labor law regime, the union regime. So again, take the example of the United States. Unionization is practically dead. A disorganized society cannot generate alternatives or act on them. Organization is a key strategic imperative of the ability to engage in this perpetual creation of the new. But some regimes of labor law are much more favorable to organization than others. So there have been in the 20th century, I began to describe at an earlier moment in the argument, two legal frameworks of labor law. In the whole North Atlantic world, the hegemonic regime is collective bargaining, the contractualist labor law regime. The workers choose whether to organize or not in unions. Freedom of contract, freedom to contract. Unionization is a choice. And under this regime, characteristically, the more privileged workers, what the Marxists call the labor aristocracy, works in the capital-intensive parts of the economy. They have interests that overlap with the interests of their bosses, with the people who buy their labor. They have common interests with them, so they're midway between being workers and being skilled employees, like the workers in the chip companies, or the chip design companies even more. And the other workers, the workers who are much less skilled or work in the less capital-intensive parts of the economy, of the production system, may be demoralized and feel that they have no options. Now, there is another labor law regime in the 20th century, which is the corporatist labor law regime, organized around two principles. The principle that everyone will be unionized automatically, all workers, combining a territorial criterion where they work and a functional criterion in what sector they work. Everyone will be automatically unionized, everyone with a job, and the whole union system then will be a framework outside the state. But in most instances of this corporatist system in the past, under the tutelage or influence of the state, acting through the mediation of a Ministry of Labor. So it's what the political scientists would call controlled popular mobilization. The populist authoritarian leader, under the cover of a presidential regime, typically imitating the American constitutional arrangement, attempts to create his own base in conventional industry and distributes political favors and subsidies through the Ministry of Labor. So he mobilizes, but he controls the mobilization in his own political interest. So you have the contractualist regime, shaped by the two principles of freedom of contract and independence from the state, and the corporatist principle, shaped by the counter principle of automatic unionization and dependence, political dependence on the state. So then the American unions, through their international offices, propagandize in favor of the contractualist system. Our system is better, but our system isn't just the US system, it's the European system also. The Latin Americans borrowed the corporatist regime from fascist Italy. Mussolini's Carta del Lavoro. And it had an ambiguous effect. On the one hand, it maintained unionization as a gift not of the state but of the law. According to law, everyone is automatically unionized. But on the other hand, it effectively subordinated the labor movement to the state and to the populist leader, the caudillo. So then it might be very important in this circumstance to reinvent the choices, to shuffle the cards, and to create a hybrid regime that would take from the contractualist system the principle, that would take from the corporatist system the principle of automatic unionization of everyone, but take from the contractualist system the principle of complete independence of the unions from the state. Then there are different movements within labor, left and right, affiliated or not to particular political parties, and those unions compete for position in the unitary structure of the state, just as political parties compete for position in the unitary structure of a democratic republic. But now it may be late. It may be too late. The ship may have sailed. Because the cause of unionization, whether under the contractualist regime or the corporatist regime, is intimately associated with the old vanguard of conventional industry, of Fordist mass production. So it's not clear that the cause of unionization can be revived, brought back to life, now under the shadow of the new vanguard. In any event, this is another fundamental domain for exploring the conditions for the perpetual creation of the new. Now there's this new social vanguard of what I described as the subjective petty bourgeoisie, the poor people who continue poor, they continue dispossessed, but subjectively their horizon of aspiration is petty bourgeois. They work desperately. Sometimes they have 2 or 3 jobs. At 5 in the morning, the train stations are full of them going to work for their first shift. They have the interest in creating this hybrid model and using it to open up the possibility. But they can't do it alone. They live in one of the most radically unequal societies in the world. They would have to have allies in the elite, in the asset-holding class. And the emergence of those allies would depend on there being a division in the elite. It would depend on the emergence within the elite of a productivist counter-elite determined to marry the project of a new cycle of industrial development with a new kind of industry, the knowledge economy, in a socially inclusive form to this mass of workers, often service workers as well as industrial workers in the existing economy. And they would be driven, this counter-elite, by a combination of interest in creating a better economic future for their country, with creating a better political future for themselves. They would need plenty of audacity. Now, on what else does the ability to create, perpetually to create the new depend? It depends, for example, on the formation of social services, of health and education. And the creation of social services requires a professional state bureaucracy, but it also requires that this state bureaucracy be able to partner with independent private providers, acting through cooperatives, not for profit. In other words, not the privatization of public services, but the assumption of public services by cooperatives of civil society. Professionals in one or another kind of public service. And the problem there is that now there is no administrative counterpart to the post-Fordist knowledge economy. The only provision of public services available in most of the world is the provision of standardized, low-quality services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. The engagement of civil society in the provision of public services together with the state as its ally or as its partner would be an invention requiring the creation of a different kind of bureaucracy with two driving forces to enhance the quality of the public services and to instigate the self-organization of civil society outside the state. Civil society engages in the creation of its own future, determined by the nature of public services. And where else can society be organized? It can be organized, for example, through social and military service. The principle that everyone should serve in the defense of the country, but the country doesn't need all of the young to serve. So those who are exempt from military service then become susceptible to the obligation of social service, meaning that depending on the direction of their education, they participate in the sector in which they are being educated to help build a country or provide services. An idea that is completely incompatible with the creation of mercenary armies in which paid soldiers, meaning the poor without other jobs, are paid to defend the asset-holding classes. Now then, another area which is intimately related to this ability to create the new is education, the education of the masses. Rejecting the elitist division between vocational training for the workers and idea training for the elites, training in the manipulation of symbolic culture. And instituting a curriculum that is an instrument of national liberation. Now, in a country that is large, unequal, and federal in structure, like the United States or Brazil, the initial imperative is to reconcile the local management of the schools by the states and municipalities with national standards of investment and quality. And in practice, that will require three instruments. First, a national system of performance and testing, school by school and student by student, to know what happens. Second, a redistributive mechanism to redistribute resources and staff from richer places to poorer places. And third, a system of trans-federal intervention that takes over local failing school systems temporarily, a system that associates the federation, the states, and the local governments, assigns them to independent reformers or professionals, and returns them fixed, like the reconstruction of a failing company by its appointed administrators or saviors. And such a project could not be the work of a clique of educational despots. It would have to be the mission of thousands of teachers in hundreds of schools, a project of national liberation. So the argument I'm making is that there is a causal primacy of initiatives like these that I've been listing that ensure a country of this ability to create the new, but that in practice, a state that is able to do this will arise only in the course of a struggle over the economic direction. And the struggle will in turn require a division of the elite between a majority of rentiers and a counter rentier, a counter elite, a productivist counter elite that opposes the rentiers. Now, this is all an extended development of the question I asked at the outset about Roosevelt. Because for better or worse, Roosevelt instituted in the country a national debate, a national struggle over the direction of the recovery. And now, in my elucidation of this theme, I'm simply changing the idiom. In my examples, I'm shifting the discussion to the current scene and the current alternatives in the realm of the adjacent possible. Now, would someone make a remark about this? Yes.
I can just summarize some of the questions that came up in our last discussion section.
Yes.
Maybe coming back to your initial conception of the knowledge economy for humanity, it's about changing the mode of production towards a more inclusive mode of production.
Yes.
As far as we understood you, this is a more collaborative, altruist model, and you gave a lot of examples which are often focused on very small sectors of society, like local agriculture. So one of the questions that came up was, given the fact that our economy is very complex, very diversified, very much dissected in different sectors and disciplines, like how do you foresee a model that is scalable also to that level of complexity?
Well, what's the difficulty that you envisage?
We weren't quite sure what do you see as like the main unit for this kind of, like what is the main unit of the economic operation? Like is it like cooperativist kind of organizations, or how would that look like in practice?
No, I think that we have to distinguish between the established large businesses, which are already part of the vanguard. There are countries in which big industry is, I think, notably Switzerland and Germany, in which big industry is already trying to make this transition from old Fordism to the knowledge economy, and is doing this with the participation of labor. That's not primarily what I was thinking of. What I was thinking of was the world of the small and medium-sized firms. And the partnership that would arise between the state and them. In Germany, between the state and the Mittelstand. And actually, one of the countries with the highest level of industry among its sectors is Switzerland. And Switzerland is a very decentralized country, which has the advantage of having a strong tradition of local participatory democracy. So it's a very favorable situation. Backed up by the participation of the citizenry in the defense of the country. It doesn't depend on a mercenary army. So I don't think of the alternatives that are being discussed as if they were somehow homespun, primitive, or counterparts in the North to primitive third world organizations. It's highly technical. And the best model for this industrial organization is the Organization of Modern Science, which is a cooperative form of organization. That's how science is conducted now, by the state institutions and by the universities. It would be hard to say that that's the major problem in the world. The focus, the edge of this innovation is in the rest of the world. In countries like India and Brazil. But for the moment, I'm not focusing on the economic content of the ideas. The question that I'm asking is, where does the vitality come from in these societies? The vitality depends on organization. And what I'm trying to do is enumerate the settings in which organization has the greatest potential to be transformative. I think it has the greatest potential to be transformative in the provision of public services, in national education, and in offering alternatives to the defense of labor. Now, what's the emergency issue today in the world with respect to labor? The emergency issue is the precariat, precarious labor. Not workers working in big firms. They're a labor aristocracy. They're relatively privileged. So in a country like Brazil, for example, if you attempt to redesign the labor laws to favor the interests of the majority of unorganized workers, everyone gangs up on you. The organized workers, especially the organized workers in industry, are a relatively privileged minority. Their interests are opposed to the interests of everyone else. Among those two labor law regimes that I described, the contractualists and the corporatists, the contractualists, which is the regime prevailing in the North Atlantic world, has three consequences. So one consequence is its tendency is to echo and reinforce the underlying divisions in the production system between the more capital intensive and the more labor intensive. As I said, the workers in the capital intensive industry have an ambiguous situation because in some respects they're partners with their bosses. The worker in a capital intensive industry in Western Europe is to some extent a partner of his employers. The labor cost is a relatively small part of the business, of the total capital expenditure. And the capitalists are constantly tempted to make a deal with their workers to the detriment of everyone else. It's only in the relatively capital poor parts of the economy that the workers have interests in contradiction to the interests of their employers. Now, I'm not considering this problem now from the standpoint of the representation of labor and its interests. I'm considering it from the particular standpoint of its interest in the instigation of novelty. And what I'm saying is that the more organization, the better. An organization suited to the special conditions of the national economy. What then is the emergency? What's the real issue? The real issue is the representative of the precarious majority. And that requires, on the one side, an attempt to represent them, but on the other side, given that they, in the short term, may not be represented, direct legal intervention in the employment relation. What kind of intervention? An intervention which insists on remunerating unstable labor by at least the level of remuneration offered to the stable labor rendered under conditions of stable employment. So what's vital is to retain an upward tilt to the returns to labor as the objective economic condition for persistent innovation. Now, I'm assuming that to the extent that a post-Fordist knowledge economy is installed, it creates an enormous economic advantage to radical innovation because one of its characteristics is to support the limit or the inversion of what is the most fundamental economic law, the most persistent economic regularity, which is diminishing marginal returns. And why does it offer the potential to stop this law of diminishing marginal returns? Because under this economy, under the system of production, innovation, rather than being episodic or punctual, becomes continuous. So go back to the question of the argument about the path of least resistance and the alternatives to it. The whole insular knowledge economy is itself an example of the path of least resistance, because it's the version of the knowledge economy that is best adapted to the unequal and oligopolistic character of these economies, to the dominant interests and the dominant ideas. Silicon Valley is an anomaly. It's not the fundamental example of the knowledge economy. It's an anomaly. Network effects, vast scale, allowing for internalization of the cost of this technology, near zero marginal cost to adding a customer, and finally taking advantage of the loophole in the law of property and of intellectual property that allows these firms to make a business out of a free commodity, which is the unremunerated data of their customers. It's an anomaly. It's not the fundamental example of the knowledge economy. So I have no doubt in Europe that the leaders of labor are fully competent technically to do the work of co-administering the businesses in which they work. That's not the problem. The problem is that their interests are not aligned in that direction. It's not a problem of their being too primitive. They're not like Indian or Brazilian agricultural workers. If you speak with them, you get the impression that they're too educated for their own good, not that they're not educated enough. Now, I think all this talk about the perpetual creation of the new fails to deal with the question of what lies behind this imperative. What are the functional requirements of these advanced economies and societies? I see twin functional requirements. One requirement is the enhancement of agency, the creation of the worker and the citizen who is capable of turning the tables on the society. And the most important fact to understand about the meaning of the enhancement of agency, and the reason why it is such a powerful ideal in contemporary societies, is that the capacity to be effective within the established order is connected to the capacity to go beyond the established order. To be effective within the role You have to be able to see beyond the role. And now let me change the vocabulary in order to explain this better. There are two sets of moves that the individual worker and citizen can make. One set of moves are the routine moves that he makes within the framework of established arrangements and assumptions. The other set of moves are the exceptional moves by which from time to time, typically under the provocation of crisis, he goes beyond the framework. The whole meaning of the enhancement of agency as an ideal, as an interest, is that these two classes of moves come closer together. So that novelty becomes banal. Rather than being an extraordinary break, it becomes part of the normal business of life. Instead of having, so let me give you yet another metaphorical equivalent to the problem I'm talking about. Remember Thomas Kuhn's famous contrast between revolutionary science, paradigm-shifting science, and ordinary science. So then there's the vision that these great geniuses, Aristotle, Newton, Darwin, who shift the paradigms or create paradigms. And everyone else is down below doing routine science. So what would be the most important transformation? The most important transformation would be that routine science acquire some of the characteristics of revolutionary science, little by little, so that these two kinds of science would come closer together. Not by the peaks coming down to the valleys, but by the valleys going up to the peaks. The enhancement of agency means that. It means that the creation of novelty becomes continuous with the ordinary business of life. And the technical economic basis for that conjecture is the suspension of the law of diminishing marginal returns. Remember what the law is. It says you commit an input to production, and you can imagine an innovation as an input, and then the return to the innovation typically goes up, plateaus, and then falls at the margin. If you could postpone the fall, in principle, indefinitely, you could suspend the law of diminishing marginal returns. And that would be a fundamental change in the economic life of mankind. But how can you suspend the law? So most innovations are imported from outside the production system, from the history of science and of technology, and then internalized in the production system. But if innovation were to become continuous rather than punctuated or episodic, the law would to that extent cease to hold. And then you could redivide the whole economic history of mankind into three stages. A first stage, only really up to the beginning of civilization, in which the dominant constraint on economic growth is simply the surplus over current consumption. Adam Smith and Karl Marx thought that that was only occurring in their own time. But we now understand that that occurred hundreds and thousands of years ago at the beginning of civilization. Already at the beginning of the first civilizations, the dominant constraint on economic growth was no longer the surplus over current consumption. It was the pace and nature of innovation, conceptual, technological, and organizational. So the first period in which the economic history of mankind is shaped by the surplus over current consumption. A second in which it's limited by the pace and content of innovations and by the constraint of the law of diminishing marginal returns, the closest thing that economics has to a genuine law. And then there would be a third phase when this law is suspended. Scarcity remains, contrary to what Keynes and Marx imagined, but the law of diminishing marginal returns is abrogated or conditionally suspended. Innovation becomes incessant in the economic realm. And all of the programmatic ideas that we're discussing are, in a way, the non-economic equivalents to that economic phenomenon. And both the equivalence and the economic phenomenon are rooted in the triumph of the imagination. The practical uses of the economic and political imagination. So there are these two functional imperatives. What makes a society successful today is the ability to fulfill, is ultimately the ability to fulfill these two imperatives. The imperative of the enhancement of agency. What's a successful society? A successful society is a society whose citizens and workers experience this empowerment of their own agency, their ability to turn the tables on their circumstance. And this ability can be translated in the way that I suggested. It consists in an enhancement of ability to act within the context, which is connected to an ability to see beyond the context. And now consider further that these two functional imperatives, the enhancement of agency and the development of the higher forms of cooperation, are both necessary, but to some extent in conflict with each other. Every institutional way of organizing cooperation in the market or in politics creates rights, vested interests, and expectations. And every innovation disturbs these rights, claims, and expectations. So there is a tension between the imperative of innovation, intimately linked to the ideal of enhanced agency, and the development of the higher forms of cooperation. What am I calling a higher form of cooperation? The higher form of cooperation is one way of defining it is to say it's those forms of cooperation that moderate this tension between the imperatives to cooperate and to innovate, To innovate, we need to cooperate. To develop the innovation, to install it, to propagate it within the existing form of social life. But every innovation disturbs the established regime of cooperation. For the reason I just said. So what's the highest form of cooperation? The highest form of cooperation is the one that allows us to innovate more without subverting the established regime of cooperation. It's the one that's most hospitable to innovation. Now let me give you a simplified example of what this means in yet another vocabulary. Take the extreme example of a scriptural caste system, not the actual caste system of Indian society, but the canonical caste system, the one that comes from the sacred writings. And you could think of it this way. The identity of the individual is inseparable from the rigidity and security of the whole arrangement of society. Because his whole conception of who he is, of his security, of his dignity, is bound up with the maintenance of this order. If you take out any thread from it, it starts to unravel. So imagine that's one pole of this imaginary spectrum. What's the opposite pole? The opposite pole is a society in which the security of the individual, his identity, is as much as possible separated from the rigidity of all social arrangements. Because the way in which we defend him, we provide the safeguards and capability ensuring endowments, is not associated with any of these rigid social arrangements. We separate them. We say, we'll guarantee you all these minima, but in exchange we'll render everything else plastic. You'll be secure in a haven of vital protected interests, which will secure your identity, but around this haven, we're going to organize a storm of innovation, conflict, and experiment. That's the opposite to the other pole. And where are we now? We're at some intermediate position on this imaginary spectrum that I just designed. So one of the metrics by which we would measure our progress is movement along this imaginary spectrum that allows us to separate as much as we can the safeguarding of the individual empowerment, the empowerment to act, which I'm calling the enhancement of agency, from the ability to cooperate. So we have this vision in which the contemporary advanced societies have these twin functional imperatives: the enhancement of agency and the development of the higher forms of cooperation. And these twin requirements, to some extent, reinforce each other, but in another sense, conflict with each other by the way I just described. And the way we would measure progress is we would say progress consists in inventing the concrete innovations that moderate or minimize this tension between the enhancement of agency and the development of the higher forms of cooperation. And then the speculative and radical discussion can be brought down to earth in examples like the examples we've been discussing. For example, with respect to labor, the development of the hybrid labor law regime that I described, which combines the contractualist principle of independence of labor from the state with the corporatist principle of automatic unionization, is an example of moderating the tension between the imperative to cooperate and the imperative to innovate. And our ingenuity in programmatic imagination could then be translated into this attempt to moderate the tension. Now, all of this is in the service of what? It's in the service of dealing with the problem that I described in the first class of the course. The world on fire for 300 years. With this revolution, inflamed by this revolutionary project, with its two sides. Political side, carried by democracy, liberalism, and socialism, with promising to lift from social life the grid of entrenched division and hierarchy, pushing us down, dividing us, subjugating us to one another. And the other side, the personalist side of Romanticism, of the worldwide popular romantic movement, and its religious background in the Semitic monotheisms, with the sublime promise to humanity that we'll all become more human by becoming more godlike. Living in societies which have become responsive to these twin functional imperatives, and living in such a way that we can die only once. But now this project is the dominant project in the world. It remains the commanding project. It's not the only project in the world. It has many enemies. But all of its enemies respond to it. It continues to command the agenda, including the agenda of its adversaries. But although it's, in that sense, still the most powerful project in the world, paradoxically, it's also weak. It's weak because its supporters no longer know what its next step should be on either the political side or the personalist side. And that's what all these arguments are about. What should the next steps be? What should the next steps be institutionally? What should the next steps be spiritually and morally? In law and in economics, but also in literature and poetry and religion. And that's the question then before us. So in this debate, the torch of life is associated with the dream, with the ideal of the perpetual creation of the new. And all of these institutional alternatives that we've been discussing, short-term or long-term, are about that. They represent the radicalization of life, of its vitality. With the defining attributes of spontaneity, surprise, and fecundity. That's the philosophical or the meta-historical background to these programmatic arguments. And you can see very clearly what its character is by contrast, for example, to Hegel's narrative. Hegel imagined an early moment in which spirit had not yet emerged. And we human beings were all at home with society. We experienced no contradiction between our subjectivity and the social. Then there was a long narrative in which spirit emerges, subjectivity emerges, and we travel then a via crucis of contradiction and conflict, which he describes in the language of European culture and European evolution. And then there's a final moment of reconciliation in which spirit is once again at home, but now married to subjectivity. So we can be self-conscious without being at war with one another or with society. Now, each of the moments of this narrative is false. We were never at home with society. There was never a moment when we were without subjectivity. The path of our liberation cannot be described uniquely in the categories of European culture. And there will never be a moment in the future when we are once again at home with society and able not to experience a contradiction between the spirit bringing the torch of novelty and the social order. And that revised view is the view which is implied in these programmatic arguments. It's a different conception of humanity. Now let me make a final set of remarks. Does someone want to speak to any of this? No. Let me make a final set of remarks about the programmatic arguments and the idea of human nature. And this is another very perplexing issue. So every change in social life, every institutional change, can be at the margin also a change in what we're like. We cannot look at ourselves and divide our attributes into two classes, the variable and the permanent. These here are central and eternal. That's the part that changes. In history, everything can change. Everything is on the table always. But that doesn't mean that we change, that we're a plastic clay that can be remodeled infinitely and without restraint according to our programmatic dreams. We change with great difficulty. And the individual agent discovers in politics that it's easier to change a country than it is to change a person. So, in historical experience, everything can change. The way in which we experience envy or jealousy, the most subjective sentiments, can be colored and reshaped by the transformations of society and of culture. There's no inner recess which is protected from history. Nothing is protected. But yet we're not this plastic clay. So the minimalist way in which we can, for the purposes of programmatic argument, define human nature is to say, human nature is what we are like now. But what we are like now is not necessarily what we are like tomorrow. And there's no way in which we can protect or insulate what we are like now against the storms of history. They can take everything, but not all of a sudden. So it's foolhardy to make a political bet which is premised on some idea of the regeneration of human nature, meaning what we are like now. It changes only with immense difficulty and at the margins. And its change is not the work of statesmen, but of prophets. And that's the rough and ready way in which I propose to deal with the question of human nature in this programmatic argument. So every time we make a political bet, a gamble, every time we engage our lives in a particular direction, we are offering or promising, in some sense, to change ourselves in some way at the margin. And these spiritual promises that we make to ourselves are in some sense always self-fulfilling promises, self-fulfilling prophecies. Like the prophecies made by the world religions, by the Semitic monotheisms. They say to us, act as if I were true and you'll make me true. And we can argue about them. We don't have to take them just as diktats that can't be argued with. We can ask, do they resonate with our deepest longings? To the extent that they are self-fulfilling prophecies, will they in practice fulfill themselves? Or will they discredit themselves? If we try and put them into practice, will they sustain themselves or will they fall apart in practice? And are they compatible with what we independently know to be the truth about ourselves or about the world? So we can certainly argue about these visions of human nature that underlie the political arguments about alternatives in world history. And these are real arguments. They aren't just shadow arguments. But they are inconclusive. It is their nature to be inconclusive. So in these arguments, which are the most important arguments, and in a sense are the only arguments which each individual human being cannot escape. They're the only choices that we can't escape. How am I to live? That's the only question that no human being can fail to answer. Everyone will answer it, whether he intends to or not, by the way in which he lives. And we can bring the light of reason to bear on these arguments, but we can't resolve them, because the arguments in the end are always disproportional to the weight of the choice that is before us. There's a gap. Let's call it the cognitive gap. And the cognitive bet requires us to have faith in one of the two senses of faith. So one sense of faith is we're required to believe more than we are entitled to believe in order to act in the world, in order to live. We cannot understand the framework of existence. We're groundless as well as mortal, and we have to place this bet. And then comes a second sense of faith. In overreaching ourselves in this inevitable cognitive overreach, we make ourselves vulnerable to one another. And that's the second sense of faith, which is inescapable to the extent that the first sense, that faith in the first sense is also inescapable. If we have to act beyond what we know, we also have to make ourselves vulnerable more than we have reason to. In the fundamental sense of unprotecting ourselves and consequently becoming vulnerable to one another. That's the personal background to this stuff about the world historical situation in which we find ourselves. The revolutionary project has been installed in the world. The flame is burning. Will we try and put it out, or will we try and continue it? Will we try to inflame it even more? In what direction? To what end? In making those choices, we will make ourselves vulnerable. We can't avoid them. We can reason about them. We can continue to think and to argue, but we cannot settle them. And that is, to my mind, the most important philosophical background to this programmatic argument that we're having in the course. It touches on ultimate questions, but it's incapable of delivering ultimate truth. So it's somehow engaged with the essential dynamic of our being, which is this dialectic of finitude and transcendence. Well, I'm sorry to deliver such a heavy message. I didn't intend it to. But I did want at the midpoint of the course to remind us of the stars. Continue next week. We'll go back to Earth next week with a discussion of high energy politics, high energy democracy. I think that Earth will be lovely after this temporary interruption. See you next week.